Well, good morning. Oh, y'all learned over the last few days. I'm Erin Maye Quade. I use she, her pronouns. I am so honored to be on a panel today with two of the most incredible visionaries that we have seen in this country. It's just three peers having a conversation today. Joining me on stage is Stacey Abrams, a New York Times bestselling author, entrepreneur, producer, and political leader, and a Georgian. Welcome home. She served 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 as minority leader, and was the first black woman to become a gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States. Yeah. Also with us is Dr. Loretta Ross, a professor at Smith College in the program for the study of women and gender, where she teaches courses on white supremacy, human rights, and calling in the call-out culture. Loretta is also a recipient of the MacArthur Fellow, class of 2002, for her work as an advocate of reproductive justice and human rights. Please give a warm welcome to this panel. So we have been talking a lot this week about wins, losses, building together, being together, and we really do. We've had some great plenaries, we've had some great breakout sessions where we know that a loss is not the end. And I often think about my own ancestors and where they might have been in history, where they might have, I had ancestors who were enslaved. There were a lot of people who were in the middle. They didn't see the beginning, they didn't see the end, they were in the middle, but they kept fighting. And I was thinking about that before I came here to Atlanta, and I realized that my grandma, who was born in Bessemer, Alabama, she was born in the 1920s, and her daughter, the only daughter she had, was born in 1964, which means I am the first woman, black woman in my family, who was born with the right to vote in every state. And so when we're talking about the reference of time and losses and wins, it can be really easy to lose ourselves in, today or what happened in the last 6 weeks, but time is long, movements are long, and that's what we're here to do is talk about movements together. And so my questions for either one of you to start out is, how long does change take? Go ahead.
Well, as someone who watches a lot of Star Trek, I can tell you the time is infinite. But the question isn't how long does change take. It is what change can we imagine each time, because we become so both linear and finite in our expectations. We think once we've gotten this thing, we're done. That's not the goal. The goal is progress, and progress should be infinite. Progress should be permanent. And when you're thinking about permanent progress, the regress seems both it's harsh, but it's not impermeable. So yeah, okay, they won this round. But if our mission is progress, then forward is always in front of us. And I think we condition ourselves to think that if we have this goal and get there, we're done. The other side's always going to come back and try to take it back. And so our mission has to be, what's next? What's after that? What's after that? And if you ever watched West Wing, we should constantly be hearing Jed Bartlett, what's next? That should be our mission. I really like TV, so I'm going to use a lot of those references.
Yeah, I can see this. I'm actually pissed off that they didn't put me in charge of the timeline. Because if they did, all of this mess would be over. Matter of fact, if they put black women in charge of the timeline, all of this mess would be over. But because we're in Atlanta, and I've had the benefit of learning from civil rights icons like Reverend C.T. Vivian, he said once to me, stop imagining that you're the entire chain of freedom. Because the chain of freedom stretches back towards your ancestors and forward towards your descendants. Your only job is to make sure that chain doesn't break at your link. And I was like, wow, that feels good. I can be as messed up as my trauma lets me be, and I can still make sure that train don't break. And that's what I call the timeline of change. I don't sweat what went before. I don't sweat what's coming. I just make sure that I don't give up, become apathetic, become cynical, and fail to spread joy.
That's beautiful. I want to ask a little bit about this feeling of hope or joy or cynicism, because I think I've waffled through many emotions. I mean, my whole life. But in the last month, I feel like I went from despondency to retribution, vengeance to resolve. And I think, there's sometimes an impulse to be like, it's going to be okay. Like, we've survived before, right? But not everybody survived. And so we sit here knowing that, like, not all our people will, and not all our people have. So how do we right size, or how do we find the positive or the hope without it being toxic or erasing of what's real?
I believe that we can't escape the horrors of what we're dealing with, and hope is required because we have to face those horrors. We're not running away from them like toxic positivity would. We're saying that our commitment to seeing the possibility of joy, excitement, like Tony Quade used to say, make the revolution irresistible. Like, everybody wants to join it. And people join things that make them feel better about themselves. You will never get people to join stuff that makes them feel worse about themselves, because they don't need any help doing that.
Yeah, I would agree. My approach to the question of optimism versus pessimism is that I don't do either one. Optimism tends to ignore reality, and pessimism tends to ignore possibility. I go with determination. And when you're determined, then your responsibility isn't to either lift or fall, it is to mitigate. There are going to be those who are harmed by the next 2 years, the next 4 years, the next decade. There are those who will not be able to withstand the onslaught. They will face retribution. They will face harm. Our responsibility is, how do we militate against that? How do we mitigate those harms? How do we, who have positions of privilege that don't feel like privilege, except that we get to be in this space and we know these spaces exist, how do we leverage our access to mitigate the harm that they will face? And how do we put ourselves in positions to sometimes bear the brunt of that harm so that we can alleviate the pain that others might feel? And those are very intentional acts, but those are also acts of hope. Because when you can put yourself in that space of mitigation, of militation, then what you're saying is, I think we can get through this. And that act of determination, to your point, moves us away from this despondency or toxic positivity into a place of action. And again, going back to the timeline, our job is to move forward. And we can't do that if we are paralyzed or if we're waiting. Neither of those are actions. Our action has to be, how do we make certain that we are mitigating as much as possible the harms that could befall, but also how are we imagining and creating the possibility of what should be? They haven't won everything. And their mission is to stop us from imagining more. There is nothing more aggressive than making stuff up. And that's got to be our job. And that's one of the best ways to create that movement that people want to be a part of, because you're creating something they can imagine themselves in, but also that they can be a part of imagining. And that's how we create coalition and create movement.
I just want to talk about whether or not I consider them winning. Because I consider those bozos demographically doomed. I don't care what they try, because their only weapons are lies and violence. Lies and violence. And on our side, we have truth. We have history. We got the evidence. We got the receipts. And most of all, we got time. And I want to say, how do I know we won? Because we've got their kids. First, we got them with our cool, then with our music, and now we got them at the ballot box. And what go black, don't go back. We got them. So it'll take more time than I like, but I have no doubt that these bozos, and that's my best word, can defeat truth, time, evidence, and history. It ain't possible.
both of you are talking about, time and movements and what we build together. How should we be thinking about movements in this current political moment? Because I think there can be this sense of, it didn't work. What do we do now? Build a new shiny thing. But you both have built strong, long movements rooted in real things that resonate with people, that bring about that lasting change. So how can we think about movements in the context of this political moment?
So I agree with Loretta about we won. But I don't believe that denies that they won too, because we can't create a space where we ignore the power they're amassing, because you can't defeat the thing you don't know. But we did win too, and I've gotten in trouble before for losing something and saying we won.
Yeah.
And the reason I do that with with intentionality is exactly your point. I don't measure my success based on their metrics. I'm not playing their game. I have a different mission. I have a different objective, and therefore I measure myself against those objectives, and that's part of our responsibility. So one way to create and sustain our intention is not to have our intention dictated by their action. When we use their metric, we are always going to lose. When we play games with their cards, the deck is stacked. So no. So let's begin by saying no to accepting that their metrics are the metrics we use to measure our progress. But I use three things. One is that our first mission is to combat disinformation. We can do that. And that is the most important thing, because when you can create a false reality, when you can convince people that truth is not truth, then that's how we've lost. So our first responsibility, and every person can do that, we can combat disinformation. We are watching we watched the preview, and now we are in the middle of it, and it is about to get even worse. And so our first responsibility is combating disinformation. And if you look at the organizations that I've founded, that Loretta's founded, they begin by telling the truth, by combating the disinformation. But it's not enough to combat the disinformation. You also have to speak truth to power. Whoever holds that power, they need to know you're coming for them. They should not be surprised when you arrive. And we sometimes think that our silence is protection. Our silence is consent. And so we have to speak truth to power, particularly when you stand in positions that don't feel quite so powerful, because there's someone who didn't even know where the position was. And so in a room of this magnitude, you all have the responsibility to speak truth to power, because you're the ones who know where the power is and where the power should be. So combat disinformation, speak truth to power. And the third is, and I'm going to keep coming back to it, we've got to imagine what we want next. We keep fighting the last war. We keep relitigating the last loss or victory. We rest in the halcyon days of this thing that we got 50 years ago. There's been a lot that's changed. So what is next? We need to stop asking for them to give us back what they've already given us and start demanding what we need for the next round, for the next life, for the next generation, instead of spending so much time clinging to the very little we got the last time they paid attention. And so if we combat disinformation, if we speak truth to power, and if we imagine and demand more, those are our three ways of actually bringing people into movement with us, bringing them into action with us, and holding them with us as we win or win less.
Yeah. I've been obsessed recently with the concept of how we build movements. Because, I was in the ground floor of the anti-rape movement in the 70s, reproductive justice in the 90s, human rights education in the 90s. And one of the things I'm obsessed about is those who should be working better together are instead turning on each other instead of to each other. And we've got to learn to do much better. That's why I and a number of people are now using the concept of calling in. I'll do a commercial on that in a minute. But the point I'm saying is we are damaged by our inability to deal with the difference between an optimal demand and and incremental demand. And I'm telling you, unless we understand that difference, yeah, we can say defund the police, but meanwhile, let's do some DNA testing to get more innocent people out of jail. We can say, you know, change the U.S. Constitution and get rid of the Electoral College, but right now, let's just fight for voting rights. You can do it and. But we're caught up in believing that if we don't get our optimal demand, then I can't work with anybody that settles for incremental change. And for me, that shows such a remarkable lack of sophistication when it comes to movement building. Because what we're dealing with are either proven allies, people we know gonna ride and die with us, problematic allies who may disagree with us on a whole lot of stuff, but we still come together like in a big march, or potential allies, people who are new to the cause, who are just now, you know, just putting up their first pride flag or whatever. And I'm tired of activists that can't tell the difference between allies and opponents with lousy threat assessments and spend all their energy fighting their potential and problematic allies instead of keeping focused on the fascist. And I just think we need to grow the F up.
Yes. I, as a legislator, I always say, like, I couldn't be one if I didn't also believe in incrementalism, right? Like, we go for the vision, and there are steps to get there, right? And so we have to take those steps. I also, and I'm saying this to a room of a lot of legislators, don't believe that the law is the liberation, right? Law is the harm reduction. Budgets can be liberatory, they can be part of the liberation, but the law is not the liberation. Community and movement is. And so for both of you being in movement, having been a legislator, talk a little bit about, and Loretta, I want you to talk a little bit about, I want you to do your commercial on calling in, but talk a little bit about what that feels like when it is the incrementalism towards the big vision, even though, you know, everyone was hoping for the whole thing today.
Well, I think I learned this in my 20s because we were so serious when we founded the first rape crisis center in this country. And I honestly thought that we would end rape against women within 20 years. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the first rape crisis center, and we are still fighting. But you know what we've won? We've won the hearts of people who say, no, women should not be raped. We made it a global crime. We have gotten people even ashamed to admit, well, until recently, that they harassed women or molested them. Now shame has become a badge of honor. It seems to be a job qualification or something. But anyway, so I look at that, and I really do believe that we have the power to envision something new like Stacey's talking about. But me, I don't even think it needs to be new. I think we need to resurrect the old. Because in 1858, Frederick Douglass called on us to build a human rights movement in this country when he protested the lynching of a black man in New York City, right? Then there was World War II, the Holocaust. Eleanor Roosevelt shepherded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then Malcolm talked about it. Martin talked about it. Audrey talked about it. Everybody's saying the same, writing the same memo that we're not paying sufficient attention to. And so I see change happening. I think we have a vision for how to make it happen, but we have to do it in a way that everybody feels included and important in that vision. And I'll just close by saying, you were talking about speaking truth to power, and I totally agree. But the other thing we have to do is grab the power to defend the truth, because that's what's really being contested. What is true? And if you can convince people that no facts matter, then you can endlessly manipulate them. And that's what we're dealing with.
One of the jobs that I had when I was minority leader, and I used to joke with my colleagues, they gave you the title leader to make you feel good, and they put minority in front of it so you never forgot your place.
Yeah.
And your job was to do three things. One was to find ways to collaborate. So to your point about incremental demands, there are things we got to get, but the majority controls whether we get them or not, so we've got to do that piece. The second is compete. And that's the optimal. Like, this is what we actually want to get to. And the third is accountability, and that, to your point, is about shame and just making people have to actually bear the consequences of their actions. One of the responsibilities as legislators is that we can compromise our vision of what can be without compromising our values. And too often we see those as one and the same. And when you come into the legislature from a community of opportunity, when you have worked as an activist, or when you get to the legislature and you're surrounded by activists, there is something seductive about abandoning your responsibility as a legislator so you can be an activist. Resist the seduction. Because they don't need you to be the activist in the legislature. They need you to be the legislator who makes the activism possible.
Hear, hear.
And we too often want to be both and we become neither. Because you cannot use the power you have when you're constantly putting it down to reach for power that's not yours. And so I would say, as legislators, part of our responsibility is to own the power of being in the legislature. It is not to pass law all the time. For those of you who are in legislatures where you are in the majority, God bless you. Mazel tov. For the rest of us, it is survival, but it's also, again, it's making that incremental progress. I used to say, like, my job is to stop stupid or at least slow it down.
Stop stupid or slow it down.
And in this moment, we're trying to stop evil or at least slow it down. And if you cannot stop it, that does not mean you let it run amok. And as legislators, sometimes your position is that you can tell everyone else what's happening. We can be the town criers. We can be the Ida B. Wells. We can be the ones who actually tell the stories because you are there to see what's happening. And we live between elections, but we exist as legislators, and I know I'm not one anymore, but we have to use our legislative sessions as truth-telling sessions. We have to use them as power-building sessions and not get distracted by the power being the law that gets passed. If we can't pass the law, what can we do? How can we use? There are multiple channels and opportunities for power in a legislative session. Find every single one of them. Make them fight you to shut you up. And make them fight you. Offer the amendments. When I was in the legislature, they had to change the rules every year because we found a new rule and we'd use it, and then they would change the rule the next session. I'm like, okay, if I can only use it once, that's fine. Like, it's a bullet. It worked. And it worked that time. And so make sure you're investigating what is possible in your bodies, especially the things that we haven't used in a while, or oldies and goodies work. And so let's make sure that we are using these legislative sessions across 50 states to use our power, because they want us to concede. They want us to be silent, or they want us to want so much that we do nothing until we think we can have it. And you have the power not to be the activist. You have the power to be the legislator. Use that power and lift it up, amplify it.
I love this this very good advice to use the power that we have where we have it. Some of the work I do is in a gender equity organization. We work with North Dakota. I just learned that every bill in North Dakota gets a hearing and it gets a vote on the floor. The way I'd be using that if I was in North Dakota in the minority. There are rules, there are policies like that in every legislature in the country. And I think it would behoove us as a movement, as a group, to know those rules, to be the details folks on those rules, because that is where you can get some things done. Make them change it. Make them change it after you find out if it works. I had the privilege backstage to watch, to listen to one of the most amazing conversations, and I kept thinking, should I ask them to wait until we're on the stage? But I didn't. But I'm just going to ask you to rehab that conversation. And it really is based in both of the work that you're doing, and it's it's aligned and there's like grit there too in the places that it might rub up against each other. And so I'm just going to let y'all do your commercial, but please have that conversation again. I'm just going to sit here and listen again.
Well, it started with Stacey talking about what she's created to not only defend DEI, but go on the offense. So why don't we start it that way again?
Okay. So I've had some time on my hands in the last few years. And one of the issues that is top of mind for me is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have been bamboozled into thinking that this is some recent phenomenon. DEI is 248 years old. We have had DEI since we've had this country, and we know it because everything we have done to shift this nation towards what it said it wanted to be, to create and manifest access to the American dream, which we can debate whether it's real or not, but the notion of it is out there. There are three ways you get there: education, what you know; the economy, what you do; and elections, who has power. They have assiduously and aggressively attacked those three things because we have effectively, over the last 248 years, built a body of law to protect and defend and bring in, to call in our communities into power. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but also Title I. Title I education, if, I don't know, you're a vice president-elect who graduated from a poor school in the Appalachian Mountains, you are a DEI graduate, because Title I was the DEI law. So is the Americans with Disabilities Act, so is the Family Medical Leave Act. Those are DEI laws. So when they say they're attacking DEI, they're attacking anything that has moved us from a moment where white men who owned land were the only ones with power in this country. Everything else is DEI. And so our responsibility is to not concede that we are afraid of DEI because they've gotten a few good headlines. DEI is in our DNA. It is how we have protected, defended, and expanded our access, and it's working. If it wasn't working, it wouldn't have been 35% of Project 2025. Mm-hmm. You don't fight over something you don't care about. And demography tells us that it's only going to get worse for those who want to return to a moment where those communities did not have access and power. So I've created a series of organizations known as the American Pride Rises Network. And I think you've heard from Deliver the American Dream is RC4, Defending American Values Coalition is RC3. We have a few other entities that are moving around quietly. But the mission is that we need to not only defend, we need to expand DEI in this country. And that begins, thank you, and that begins by not giving up the name. Changing the name of DEI, the one they're putting out there is MEI, Merit, Excellence, and Intelligence, which
they have none of.
Merit based on what? Excellent based on which measure? And intelligence is, anyway. Suffice it to say, changing our name, changing the call to action. Diversity means all people. Equity means fair access to opportunity. And inclusion means creating a pathway for anyone to get to their American dream. I fundamentally, aggressively, and vehemently oppose changing it, because that's like changing your name because a bully mocks you. They're just going to mock the new name and make fun of you for changing it. That said, there is also an expansion opportunity, and I will turn it over to my friend to talk about the expansion opportunity.
Thank you. I totally agree with you.
Okay, the genius agreed with me, so let's just all be
right,
really clear.
Yeah. But because I've spent my last 35 years studying fascism and teaching about it, teaching about white supremacy, I understand the role that white identity politics and white identity grievance is being manipulated by these bozos. I'm trying to keep it clean, y'all, so I'm just going to continue to call them bozos, because what I really feel, my mama wouldn't approve. Mama wouldn't approve of it, so I'll just call them bozos. And the reason that they are allowed to manipulate white identity politics is that they don't feel that our framework of DEI includes them. As a matter of fact, they perceive themselves as losing because of it. And so I'm saying, well, one of the things that kind of sets them on their heels is to use such an obviously inclusive framework, which is called human rights. Because every human being has the same human rights. But because of our individual intersectional identities, we all need something different to protect them. Like every child has a right to an education, but a blind child needs her book in Braille. Not because she has more rights, but she has vulnerabilities that have to be attended to get to the same place as the sighted child. So as a strategy, I agree with you, but as a strategy, I'm like, why are we not presenting and branding ourselves with the framework that they're on the defense about? Because they have to now message why they're against human rights. And I don't think that's a good look for them. And at the same time, the human rights framework lets us talk about race, class, gender identity, ability. All of those things are in there. So that's it. There's also a question of what in the human rights movement we call justiciability. I hate that word. But whether we can litigate on it. Now, we as black people have never been able to rely on the courts to deliver our liberation. I got that. But when the people wrote the U.S. Constitution, they happened to put in there something called Article 6, which basically says that when the U.S. government, through a 2/3 majority of the Senate, ratifies an international treaty, is the same as having passed a federal law. And so these people are proclaiming states' rights, but their use of states' rights is contradicting the treaty obligations the U.S. has already signed, right? And so it's a question of whether or not they're going to be allowed to get away with it, you know, but historically this country has not allowed states to override federal law. And I'm not convinced that those bozos can summon 66 senators to unratify those treaties that happened long ago. So we could debate whether, but see, let me just close by saying, and the legal part is the least of it, because you have to achieve human rights for its moral possibilities first. What do human beings deserve? And then its political possibilities. I want to elect candidates like you that tell me how many kids they're going to send to college, not to jail. Right? That's the political possibilities of it. And then the legal, we're going to lose, but we still got to litigate. Violate this treaty, we're going to take your butt to court, and you have to then defend the right of your state to violate a federal law. I think that would be a contest we could use as an educational opportunity for the American public.
And so yeah, please. So the debate is a strong word. The tactical discussion we had backstage was one of how to approach this, because the extent to which we shift or expand to a human rights framework, we need a human rights framework. I absolutely agree. But the attack on DEI does not diminish because we changed the name.
Right.
And we have not built yet the human rights framework to subsume fully the attacks that are happening to DEI. And so our discussion was, I think it is absolutely critical and important that we pursue, expand, and level up the human rights framework. But I'm very not cautious. I am opposed to doing so instead of the DEI fight, because the DEI fight is happening in this moment because they're trying to also erase, to your point, the moral values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you can erase the morality, then you don't have to worry about the implementation of treaty, because this is not a nation that has always abided by its treaties. And the justiciability issue is very critical because there are three tactics that they use. They begin by demonizing what we know. So they mock our language, they mock our intention, they appropriate our language, they take what we know and they try to convince us it's not true. See critical race theory. See what they're doing right now to transgender children. They are very good at demonizing and delegitimizing our values. Then they move on to litigation. They sue to try to dismantle the federal framework that protects us, because they know that as long as there's federal law, federal treaty, as long as the federal government is in place, their ability to discriminate is mitigated by the fact that we actually have laws to protect us. Which is why at the exact same time they go to legislation at the state level. And that's why you all are so critical. They know that as long as there is federal protection, there is a buffer against how effective they can be. That is why Project 2025 spends so much time thinking about how to dismantle through executive action DEI, because they know getting rid of all of the federal laws, getting rid of the constitutional amendments is nearly impossible, but they can weaken it. But what they can do at the same time is make it legal for states to discriminate. That's what they did with the Voting Rights Act. They didn't get rid of the full Voting Rights Act. What they got rid of was Section 5. What they got rid of was the ability for it to apply to certain states, so those states were free to discriminate as they saw fit. The Dobbs decision did not create a federal abortion ban. It said states are now free to discriminate against women as they see fit. Students for Fair Admissions did not eliminate the use of race in education. It limited the use of race in admissions decisions, and yet Duke University and the state of Michigan and the state of Utah and the state of Georgia are using that law to justify discrimination. And the reality is we cannot allow them to distract us and say that discrimination is because it's called DEI and not something else. They are coming after us because it's working, but they are not winning. Let's think about the litany of companies that they've been able to tout. Tractor Farm Supply, Harley Davidson, John Deere, Walmart. These were not exactly hotbeds of diversity, but they were also low-hanging fruit. Our responsibility is not to get distracted by the victories they claim, but look at who they're not talking about. There are 4,000 public companies in this country. When I can list all of the ones you've been able to get, I'm in good standing. So our job is to make sure the rest of them are afraid to join that line and join that litany. Our job is to know as state legislators what is coming and not just try to stop it, but how do we push back and how do we demand even more? Because what I love about the human rights framework is what should we be demanding on behalf of our people? Make them tell us why not. And that's where I think Loretta is absolutely right about adopting this human rights framework, but we've got to do both and. We cannot let them fracture us and say, well, we'll defend human rights, but not DEI. Because they want us to let the vulnerable fall so that we're focused on the larger picture. And if we're focused on the larger picture, we're missing the individual harms that they are doing. And those individual harms aggregate very quickly. And if you want to learn more, go to aprnetwork.org.
And I just want to bring, because I totally agree with Stacey, it is an and, but it's also part of their strategy to divide and conquer. I remember back in the 1990s when we were working on the Georgia mask law, and these Republicans told us, well, if you just don't include LGBT rights, we'll support you. And we were like, oh, hell to the no. We're not going to divide our own coalition just because you're going to promise something and then renege on it. And so we don't have a mask law still in Georgia because it was strategically stupid for them to think that we were going to just, oh, we'll just throw the queer people under the bus and then the black people will be happy. And so one of the things that really works for me with the human rights framework is this unifying power. Because you can't fight for women's rights in a racist way, but you can't fight for black civil rights in a homophobic way. You know, you can't fight for trans rights in a misogynist way. But you know, it's like you can't go around creating contradiction in your own movement because we're all part of the same movement. And that's what people have to feel. And I hate to say this, particularly white people. Because if we could have gotten rid of white supremacy by ourselves as black people, it'd have been long gone. We need to give white people who are urgently needed to help us in this fight, a place to feel that they're included, specifically for them to use their white privilege in a way to defeat white supremacy.
See, I told you it was a good conversation. I'm glad I brought it out on stage. You know, I'm thinking about, and I want to still make sure, Loretta, that you have a chance to talk about the calling in, because, you know, I love learning about, is APR Rises. You want to say it again?
It's aprnetwork.org.
aprnetwork.org.
And you're going to hear from so Deliver the American Dream. If you hear from us asking you to introduce legislation in your state, answer, okay?
If Stacey Abrams calls you, you better answer.
There we go.
Now, Loretta, do you want to talk about the work you're doing on calling in?
Yeah, I'm kind of late to social media. Only about 10 years ago did I even notice what was going on. But once I got on it, I found how unbelievably cruel people were on social media. And I asked my young people around me, what is this? And they called it the call-out culture. And I asked them, what are y'all doing about it? And they shrugged like it was inevitable. I didn't like that answer. And so for the last 10 years, I've been working on developing a theory, a framework, and a practice of transforming calling out into calling in. And my book on it comes out February 4th as a Black History Month release. But I actually think that calling in is a strategic choice, because when we can have difficult conversations with the people we'd rather cancel, we're actually pulling off the soft underbelly of our opponents. You know, because most of them, by the way, don't believe in fascism, but they get manipulated by fascists, you know? And if we can figure out a way to drop our arrogance and learn to talk to people instead of talking down to people, I think we can win and make a more effective power base. So the name of the book is Calling In, How to Make Change with Those You'd Rather Cancel. And I got a whole lot of people I want to cancel. But I'm teaching people, how do you have these hard conversations with people who will say to a person, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not this. How do we have these conversations with these people? You know, and we have to do it by respecting them, owning our values, but helping them understand how we have something in common. For example, I like going to churches, right-wing churches even, that have feeding programs for people. And with them, I'll say, you feed the hungry. And as a human rights activist, I ask why they're hungry in the first place. We're in the same movement. That's how you start calling people in, showing your shared values. Don't stay at the top level with, you know, because our elite language sounds like Martian to them anyway. When we say, what's your pronoun? They don't know what the hell that stuff is, and they're mad because they don't know, because it makes them feel stupid because they don't know. But you can talk to people if you learn to call yourself in first and stop making assumptions about them because of the labels you attach to them. So that's what the book is about.
So we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask two questions. The first is, tell me a little bit about what an irresistible future would look like for you.
What the future will look
What
like?
an irresistible future would look like for
An
you.
irresistible future for me. I want a future where everybody gets to express their joy, their vitality, and most of all, their kindness towards each other, where things like honor and integrity are taken for granted instead of being bitterly fought over. I want a future where everybody gets to decide what happens to their own bodies. I want a future where people aren't in pain for being trapped in what they feel is the wrong body. I mean, there's just so much I want. And I'm like you, though, because I'm a sci-fi girl. I actually write it, and I majored in chemistry and physics, so I'm real left brain. And I want a future as good as Star Trek promises.
I'm smart enough not to go after that.
I think you gotta.
So I'm more pedestrian in my intentions. My work is driven by the fact that I think poverty is immoral. I think it is economically inefficient. I think it is a waste of human capital. I think it squanders potential, and it limits our achievements. And so the eradication of poverty for me is the driving mission. I've rejected my entire life. The first time I heard the scripture in Matthew, the poor will always be among you, it was never intended as an excuse. It was a call to action. And the work that I do, the world I believe in, the world I imagine, is one where poverty is eradicated, and not just material poverty, but poverty of imagination, poverty of spirit, the notion that we are in a zero-sum society, that my success demands your oppression. And so how do we eliminate poverty as a native good? And how do we do everything in our power to demand this abundance of access, an abundance of opportunity, an abundance of imagination, so that we are able to get to the transporters that we deserve and the food replicators I've been waiting for? How do we make the world a place where poverty is no longer a given, and instead it's an insult? And that's the world I want.
So my irresistible future, I think I live there. So the only part I'd add is I really want to live in a world where we are in community with each other, like literal, like with your neighbors, like the people that you live near, you see often and intentionally. And the idea of doing something for them to help them out is not like this major inconvenience in your life, but a normal way we go about it. I feel like we have it within us to treat each other that way, a we instead of a me. And I want like walkable communities. I want places where we go together to just like hang out and be. I want us to have third spaces. I want kids to have third spaces in particular. I want us to be with each other a lot more. So then I'm gonna go into the last question, and I'm gonna answer it first because I could never answer it last with this panel. The question is gonna be, what are you doing that brings you joy? I must steal that from Tamika from earlier this week. For me, I have a 2.5-year-old. She is so happy to be here on this planet. She loves to be here. Every morning she wakes up, she is singing. She is excited about every single thing. She loves going to Target and like scanning things. Best things ever happened to her in her entire life. And I told Stacey this backstage, but when I take her to the library in our community, there's the kids area, and there's like this tiny sliver of bookshelf that's available to me that I would get books from the fiction shelf, and it's just the A's, and it's just the ABs. And so I've read all of Stacey Abrams' books because it's the only ones I could grab from right there. It was either her or Mitch Albom, but they are great books, and I have to recommend them. And that is what's bringing me joy.
Thank you. Well, I think, so actually I'm going to invert the question and say one thing you raised, what would bring me joy? In addition to defending and protecting DEI. I recently published children's books. I write children's books and adult books. I write a lot. And so I have a children's series, and the last book was called Stacey Speaks Up. And it's a book about how Stacey, our intrepid elementary school kid, tries to help a classmate get lunch because the child is denied lunch and she doesn't understand why. And she tries to solve the problem without having to speak up. And she doesn't, because she doesn't want to call attention to herself. And she realizes that she has to combine empathy and advocacy to do this work. My mission, what would make me so joyous, is if we spend 2025 guaranteeing every child in this country the absence of hunger. That we use, so I wrote the book, but I would encourage everyone, and that we engage, I keep thinking about, and Loretta, you'll appreciate this, the Children's March, that we spend so much time from the top down. It would bring me such joy to see children believe in this moment that can feel so overwhelming and so dark, that they have the power to create light and to share with their neighbors and to help their friends, and for them to be part of what would be this movement to guarantee that children do not go hungry in this country. That it is literally the least that we could do, and it would bring me joy if this community and communities across the country decided that we were going to feed our children and let them grow and rise and be the best they could be.
I have to honestly say, my immediate source of joy is that I have as many friends who are totally non-political as I have political ones. I mean, I might be protesting a war, and they'll be doing yellow ribbons to support the soldiers. And they're so important in my life because they keep me balanced and in perspective and out of my bubble of most people who agree with me. And I treasure them so much. But, we're old now, so we read funeral programs like they're playbills from the theater. But I love the fact that they are people who their only civic engagement is to vote. But they do so much in sustaining friendship and community and stuff like that. And if I told them about heteropatriarchy, they think I was cussing them out. And so they bring me so much joy because it's regular folks trying to do the right thing, and it keeps me sane to know that they'll be at my funeral while my leftist friends might be criticizing, well, she didn't do that before she died. So that brings me joy.
Dr. Loretta Ross, Honorable Stacey Abrams, thank you so much.
Thank you.